Hello, my name is Bea Schimmer, and I'm happy to be here today to share my story with you. In a speech on October 4th, 1943, in Posen, a city that is now in Poland, Heinrich Himmler, one of Hitler's right-hand men and the architect of the final solution, said this: "The Jewish people is being exterminated. It is perfectly clear. It's part of our plans. We're eliminating the Jews, exterminating them." I was born in 1933, the year Hitler came to power. Adolf Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany on January 30th of that year by then-President Paul von Hindenburg. Contrary to common belief, Hitler was not elected. He was appointed because the chancellor at that time could not get majority support in the Reichstag, the German parliament. Germany had been a republic only 14 years, with little experience in democracy, and was undergoing a deep depression in 1933. The German people were desperate for relief. There were no jobs, there was no food or other needs for survival. Many were distrustful of this new form of government and preferred to return to a Germany headed by the Kaiser. When Adolf Hitler became chancellor, it didn't take long for him and the people he placed in powerful positions to overturn the constitution of the Weimar Republic, and the Nazi dictatorship began. Within weeks after Hitler was appointed and the Nazis came to power, numerous detention camps were established. Real or perceived opponents to the Nazi Party were being arrested. In March 1933, Dachau, the first concentration camp, was established near Munich. It was designed to hold political prisoners and became the model for the concentration camp system that spread throughout Germany and Nazi-occupied Europe. Between 1933 and 1945, 40,000 camps were created, where human beings were subjected to forced labor, medical experiments, starvation, all manner of torture and atrocities, and finally, extermination. Many death camps were located in Poland, which had the largest Jewish population. Jews were transported to the camps in overloaded cattle cars or by forced march. Jumping forward in history just for a moment with regard to the camps. During World War II, General Dwight D. Eisenhower was Supreme Commander of the Allied forces in Europe. When he witnessed the liberation of the first concentration camps toward the end of the war in 1945, he was so horrified by what he saw, he ordered that photographs and films record for posterity the atrocities perpetrated by the Nazis. Anticipating that these Nazi atrocities might be denied in the future, Eisenhower wanted to be personally photographed along with his top generals, Omar Bradley and George S. Patton, in as many camps as possible to document the horrors of Nazi persecution and genocide. Very few concentration camp survivors are with us today to tell their stories of the events leading to Himmler's final solution. The persecution and destruction of the Jewish people throughout Nazi-occupied Europe. It now falls to my generation to tell our stories, and I'm here to share my story with you. I was born in Kronheim, a small town in Bavaria, Germany. The house in which I was born was on the main street that ran through town. This is the house in which I was born. I was born in that room right there. There was a Catholic church a few doors down. The parish priest, Father Wagner, lived across the street from us. He and my father were good friends and often took long walks together, deeply involved in theological conversation. This is the church here. This is the Schloss, which is a castle in German, and a street scene. Our living quarters opened onto the street, and that's the main street that runs through town. From inside our home, we could hear the goose-stepping Nazis as they marched by and the rumble of military vehicles. The back portion of the house contained the synagogue. Here, my father, who had rabbinical training, officiated as cantor, teacher, and religious leader of the Kronheim congregation. And that is a picture of my father. There were beautiful stained glass windows 2 stories high on the side of the synagogue. Father Wagner reported in his diary that on 2 separate occasions, unidentified thugs threw rocks at the stained glass windows and smashed them. He wrote that the service was interrupted by screaming congregants as the glass from these great windows shattered among them in the synagogue. Many years later, when I read that, I thought, oh my goodness, I was there when that happened. I don't remember the incident, but according to Father Wagner's diary, it happened within 2 years after the Nazi Nuremberg laws were enacted. As early as April 1933, the first major law to limit Jewish participation in German public life was enacted. It became known as the Civil Service Law and prohibited Jews from state service and participation in organizations, professions, and other aspects of public life. Laws between 1933 and 1938 were passed that restricted Jewish students from German schools and universities, including medical schools. They excluded Jews from medical and legal professions. Jewish doctors were prohibited from treating non-Jewish patients and were no longer paid by state health insurance funds. Trade between non-Jewish Germans and Jews was prohibited. In 1934, Jewish actors could no longer perform on stage or screen. On September 15, 1935, within 2.5 years after Hitler came to power, the Nuremberg laws were enacted. They were designed, first of all, to deprive Jews of their German citizenship, even those who had been born in Germany and had roots going back many generations, like my mother's family, whose German family tree goes back to the 1700s. Jews who had served honorably in the armed forces, like my grandfather, and those who had served Germany in countless other ways, were no longer allowed to vote or hold public office. They could no longer get medical care at non-Jewish clinics or hospitals, or be treated by non-Jewish healthcare practitioners. The Nuremberg laws prohibited Jewish households from employing German female domestic workers under the age of 45. They not only outlawed marriage between a non-Jewish German and a Jew, they prohibited any close relationships between Jews and non-Jewish German. Some memories of Kronheim are those I remember, and some that were told to me by family members. One vivid memory that I do remember was of the fire we were all watching one night from one of the upstairs windows of our house. The home of our neighbors 2 doors down was burning to the ground. I remember vividly the bright orange flames exploding upward into the night sky. In later years, when I related this memory to my father, he was amazed because he said I was only 2 when that happened. He told me the firemen were dancing in the street in front of the burning house, trumpets blaring, making no effort to stop the fire. The house was owned by Jews. It was 1935, the year of the Nuremberg laws. The refusal of the village firemen to make any attempt to put out the flames that were consuming this Jewish family's home foreshadowed what would become known as the Holocaust. This is a picture of my sister and me. That's my sister, and that's me. Another incident that was reported by my sister, age 5 at the time, is how she and I were accosted in front of our house by neighborhood boys. I was 3 at the time. They were throwing stones at us, and one of them hit my sister. She carried the scar on her right temple the rest of her life. Kronheim was a small village in an agricultural area surrounded by farms and dairies. My mother would buy milk, butter, eggs, and other farm products from a neighboring farmer's wife. When it became illegal for non-Jewish merchants to sell to Jews, my mother told the woman she would no longer buy from her because she did not want to put her in danger. The farmer's wife, however, courageous and righteous as she was, insisted on supplying our family with food. At great risk, and so that no one would know, she would come in the dead of night, hide the items under the back doorstep, and collect the money my mother had hidden there. This was a time when the German people were instructed to report anything they saw that was not in compliance with the new laws. School children were to report to their teachers any illegal activity, even those committed by their own parents. Some children did indeed report their parents, and stories about children watching as one or both parents were dragged off to concentration camps were whispered among the villagers. Those people who did not agree with Nazi policies and who, like the farmer's wife, came to the aid of Jewish families, did so at great peril, not only to their freedom, but to their very lives. Early in the 1930s, when the Nazi regime passed a law forbidding the kosher slaughter of animals, it meant that kosher meat would no longer be available to the Jews of Germany. According to Jewish dietary laws, animals certified for kosher consumption must be killed in the most humane and clean way. In my father's profession, in addition to his credentials of teacher and leader of the Kronheim congregation, he was also certified to slaughter chickens and cattle for kosher meat. Before this was passed, my father provided these services in several small towns around Kronheim in his district. There were few cars in the area at that time, and the way he traveled was by motorcycle. And that is my father, that's my mother, and that's a family friend. My father was a biker. One day, my father was teaching in Heidenheim, a small town nearby, when a woman arrived at the site. She held out a sack of live chickens and asked my father to slaughter them. During their conversation, in which my father was explaining to the woman that it would be illegal to do what she asked, 2 Nazi policemen and a Gestapo agent stormed in, accused my father of violating the law and threatened to arrest him. My father denied breaking the law and showed them the sack of live chickens. He also showed his Hungarian passport. The Nazis left without making the arrest, but 1 week later, my father was summoned to the Nazi district office. At the district office, my father's passport was confiscated, and he was told he was being deported to Hungary. Since he was born in Hungary, he was not a German citizen even before the Nuremberg laws. He had lived and was educated in Germany from early childhood, but was considered a Hungarian national with a Hungarian passport. The following month, my father received his passport and orders to be out of Germany in 4 weeks. My mother and my sister and I were scheduled to join my mother's sister and her family, who were fleeing to Holland to escape the Nazis. Had we joined my aunt and her family in Amsterdam, I would not be here today to tell my story. We learned after the war that my Aunt Selma and Uncle Sigmund Sundheimer, their teenage daughter Teresa, and our Aunt Paula were exterminated in death camp Sobibor. They, along with an estimated 140,000 Jews, were deported to concentration and death camps after the Nazis overran the Netherlands in 1940. In 1936, under threat of deportation and witnessing what was happening to the Jewish people under the Nazi regime, my father felt that the safest place for his family to be was off the European continent altogether. He immediately began searching for a country that would accept Jews. Most countries, including the United States, denied Jewish refugee immigration. At the Council of Immigration in Munich, my father found a brochure that advertised possible acceptance of Jewish refugees in Colombia, South America. The council officer was not a Nazi. He had my father close the door to his office and went so the secretary in the outer office would not hear. And he contacted a refugee organization on my father's behalf. Within 2 weeks, word came that Cali, Colombia would accept our family in Colombia, South America. My father was successful in obtaining a 4-month extension on his passport that allowed him to leave Germany with his family instead of his alone being deported to Hungary. On April 24, 1937, the SS Caribia left Hamburg, Germany with our family on board. When we got to our stateroom, one last indignity was visited upon us. Every trunk, suitcase, and hand luggage that had been delivered to our cabin had been opened, and all the contents dumped onto the floor. Gestapo officers were rummaging through our belongings. They suspected smuggled currency, gold, and other valuables. My mother was a gutsy lady who was very skilled with needle and thread. She had secretly sewn a few pieces of jewelry into some of her clothing. Imagine how terrified she must have been while our belongings were being ransacked by these Nazis. Finding nothing, they left the ship empty-handed. My father was also pretty nervous. He had hidden his collection of rare and scholarly books among the furniture and other goods Jews were allowed to take with them upon leaving Germany. He hoped they were safely stored in the hold of the ship. My father's collection of 177 volumes were safely smuggled out of Germany, escaping the huge bonfires of burning books, torn from Jewish homes, shops, and synagogues. The rabbinical working library of Reverend Hermann Deutsch, my father, now resides in the rare book room of the Judaica Suite in the George A. Smathers Libraries at the University of Florida in Gainesville. I celebrated my 4th birthday on the ship with a surprise party arranged by the crew in the dining hall. Interestingly enough, it was a German ship line and crew, but they were not Nazis, and they treated the Jewish families on board with respect and kindness. They provided kosher food and attended to the needs of the Jewish passengers graciously. On May 20th, 1937, the SS Caribia docked in Buenaventura, Colombia, South America. The voyage had taken 27 days. My father, a gifted linguist, took that time to teach himself Spanish, which was a great help when we arrived, the rest of us not understanding a word that was being said. Dock activity was fascinating to me at age 4. Stevedores yelling at one another to move crates and barrels, the vivid colors and smells of foreign foods, fruits and vegetables in huge nets swinging overhead from ship to shore, and especially the heat of the equator. From Buenaventura, we traveled by train to Cali, where life was difficult and primitive in many ways. And this is a picture of my father, my sister, and me, my mother, my sister, and me. During that time, my sister and I learned to speak Spanish fluently. She started school. I played outside every day with neighborhood kids. But there was no work for my father. He supported the family by building and selling furniture and doing odd jobs, a carpentry skill he had learned as a young man in Germany. He and my mother tried to earn money by providing kosher chickens to the Jewish community, not successfully. With difficulty, my mother cooked and baked bread in a primitive wood stove and oven, and did her best to care for our family. The Jewish community grew from the 50 when we arrived to an estimated 400 as other refugees poured into Cali. Using his teaching and rabbinical skills, my father organized a functioning congregation, all without a salary, since the Jewish community had no funds to pay him. There is to this day a synagogue in Cali that may have in its history the name Reverend Herman Deutsch, my father. We lived in Cali, Colombia, 2 years, from 1937 to 1939. We had left Kronheim without a trace. The members of the Kronheim Jewish community who were aware we were leaving did not survive the Holocaust. Consequently, there is nothing in the records of Kronheim that indicate what happened to my father and his family. Local historian and archaeologist Ralph Rosmeisel, in his book, Kronheim as Microcosm, One Village, Three Religions, describes how the three religions, Catholic, Jewish, and Protestant, lived in harmony in Kronheim before the Nazi era. Based on his book, he created a museum in which there is a wall plaque which lists the names of the local Jewish residents who died in the Holocaust. Because there was no way of knowing that my family had left Kronheim, my father's name is included in the list with the members of his congregation who were unable to leave Kronheim and perished in the Holocaust. Imagine my shock when I saw his name up there. Also named among them were Nellie Schulman, who was a neighbor, dear friend, and babysitter to my sister and me, and Leo Hubert, president of the Kronheim congregation, and his wife Hedwig, close friends of my parents. The Huberts' children, Selmar and Emmy, had been sent to a Jewish school in Nuremberg when the law forbade their attendance in the local school. In Nuremberg, Selmar and Emmy experienced the power Hitler had over Germany. In later years, after immigrating to the United States, Sel Hubert wrote in his memoirs that Nazi rallies attended by thousands every year in Nuremberg were led by Hitler, where he complained how he was going to make them great again. and they believed it. Selmar and Emmy were fortunate to go to England on the Kindertransport, which was established by the British government between 1938 and 1940 to save as many Jewish children as possible. 10,000 children, most of them Jewish, but many of other faiths, were saved from the Holocaust through the kindness and generosity of the many English families who took in children and cared for them until after World War II. Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass, brought the destruction of Jewish homes, businesses, and synagogues across Germany and Austria on November 9, 1938. Nazis broke into Jewish homes and synagogues, dragged books written by Jews and anti-Nazis into the streets and burned them. As a teenager, my cousin Eric witnessed this atrocity in his own home in Heidelberg. His father's entire library had been ransacked and thrown into the street. Many years later, he told me this story and how after the Nazis left, he went into the street and salvaged as many books as he could and repaired as many as could be restored. 100 years before the Nazis started ordering book burnings in 1933, German poet Heinrich Heine wrote, "This was a prelude only. Whenever they burn books, they will also in the end burn human beings." The children of my father's 2 brothers, 2 girls and 2 boys, who lived in Heidelberg, were sent to Sweden to live with my father's sister's family. The boys continued on to what was then Palestine. All the children survived the Holocaust. Their parents were deported from Heidelberg to the Jewish ghetto in Budapest, Hungary, and were among the 565,000 Hungarian Jews who perished in the Holocaust. In 1938, my mother's brother, my Uncle Joseph Gallinger, and his family had been fortunate to immigrate directly to the United States from Germany through his wife's American relative, and they were living in Jacksonville, Florida, where he was employed as Hebrew teacher at the Jacksonville Jewish Center. My mother wrote Uncle Joe and asked if he could arrange a sponsor for us to immigrate to the U.S. It was late 1938 or early 1939, and times were difficult in the United States. The Depression was still affecting most Americans, but he did eventually find a member of the Jewish community in Jacksonville who would sponsor our immigration to the United States. In March 1939, my parents, my sister, and I left Cali, Columbia to start a new life in the USA. We boarded the Grace Line ship SS Santa Clara and headed for New York. This was another new adventure for me. I must have checked out every deck, nook, and cranny on that ship. Before we arrived in the U.S., my sister and I had heard about the Statue of Liberty, and we wanted to see it as the ship sailed into New York Harbor. We asked our mother to get us up if we were sleeping. Because the ship arrived between 4 and 5 o'clock in the morning, my mother didn't have the heart to wake us. So we missed the opportunity, and it's something I'd wanted to do ever since. When we arrived at the port of New York in March 1939, it was so cold. Here we came from 2 years of year-round summer on the equator to freezing temperatures in New York City. For what seemed like hours, my sister and I were running from one end of this huge barn of a structure to the other, trying to keep warm while our parents worked through customs and immigration. In the 6 months my family lived in New York City, my father could not find work. In the fall, he received a letter from my Uncle Joe Gallinger that there was an opening in Jacksonville for someone with his skills. Credentials were exchanged by mail, and my father was hired. We arrived in Jacksonville in October 1939 and made a life there. After 5 years, we became American citizens. My parents had learned to speak, read, and write English fluently. My sister and I attended school through high school until we went off to college. My parents moved first to Miami and then to Miami Beach. My father taught Hebrew and biblical history and prepared candidates for bar mitzvah until he retired. In 2004, at age 71, I happened to be in New York. Recalling how my sister and I missed the opportunity to see the Statue of Liberty when we arrived in the U.S. in 1939, I got on a tour boat headed for the Statue of Liberty. The overwhelming emotion I experienced seeing that magnificent symbol of freedom from the point of view of an arriving immigrant is one I shall never forget. Inscribed on a plaque at the base of the Statue of Liberty are the following lines from the poem The Colossus by Emery Lazarus. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless, tempest-tossed, to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door. The Statue of Liberty is a symbol of the basic principles upon which the United States of America was founded. I am an immigrant whose life was saved by these principles. My story would not be complete without my sharing with you my concern about the recent rise of global anti-Semitism, of countries leaning toward authoritarian governments, and the threat to the basic principles of liberty designed by the founding fathers of our country. I am reminded of Pastor Martin Niemöller's warning. Pastor Niemöller was a Lutheran minister who spent 7 years in concentration camps for opposing the Nazis and for criticizing the German people and the church leaders for their silence in the face of atrocities perpetrated by the Nazi regime. In his words, first they came for the socialists, and I didn't speak out because I wasn't a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I didn't speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for Jews, and I didn't speak out because I wasn't a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me. Pastor Niemöller's words clearly illustrate how persecution of the one eventually victimizes the many. Every year on the 4th of July, we celebrate the birthday of the United States of America, a republic based on democratic principles. Thomas Jefferson, the author of the Declaration of Independence and future president of the new nation, wrote this: "The care of human life and happiness, and not their destruction, is the first and only object of good government." Emery Lazarus, of the Statue of Liberty poet, wrote, "Until we are all free, we are none of us free." The late Elie Wiesel, Holocaust survivor, wrote in the preface of his book Night, and I quote, "Having survived, I needed to give some meaning to my survival," unquote. He needed to tell his story. While I am not a concentration camp or death camp survivor, I understand that need, and I am here to tell my story. It doesn't hold a candle to the stories told by survivors who went through the horrors of the Holocaust, but maybe something in my experience will resonate with current and future generations and do 3 things. Keep the true history of the Holocaust alive. Encourage those who hear my story to speak out against prejudice and against the mistreatment of another human being. And encourage the electorate to vote for leaders who will preserve the democratic principles upon which our country was founded. Eleanor Roosevelt put the responsibility of preserving freedom squarely on you and me when she said, "Freedom makes a huge requirement of every human being. With freedom comes responsibility." Power is in the people. Your vote is your voice. Let your voice be heard. Know your candidate. Your vote will decide how you and I, our children, our grandchildren will live in America. In our system of government, the power is in the people. Let your voice be heard. Thank you for being here to hear my story.